The transport shuttle dropped through Kolithara's upper atmosphere with all the grace of a thrown brick, and Eli Voss spent the descent wondering if diplomatic immunity covered vomiting on alien upholstery. Through the viewport, the royal moon revealed itself in layers. First the gossamer clouds that tasted faintly of copper when they condensed on the hull, then the sprawling canopy of what the briefing materials had cheerfully called semi-sentient forest, and finally the palace itself, rising from the landscape like a frozen scream of architectural ambition. It wasn't built so much as grown, crystalline spires emerging from living stone in patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if the structure existed in more dimensions than his eyes were equipped to process. First time on a psionic world, Professor Voss. The pilot, a grizzled woman with the kind of face that suggested she'd seen too much of the galaxy and had opinions about most of it, didn't bother hiding her amusement at his white-knuckled grip on the seat restraints. Is it that obvious? You've been muttering linguistic conjugations under your breath since we hit orbit. Dead giveaway. Academics always retreat into their comfort zones when they're terrified. Eli couldn't exactly argue with that. He'd spent the past 3 hours mentally cataloging Ithari grammar structures, verb tenses, the 17 degrees of formal address required for speaking to royalty. Anything to avoid thinking about the fact that he'd been selected, summoned, really, to teach the common tongue to Princess Saraline, heir to the radiant throne, daughter of a civilization that had been bending quantum mechanics to their will while humanity was still figuring out bronze. The shuttle settled onto the landing platform with a hydraulic hiss, and Eli's stomach took a moment to remember where it belonged. Through the viewport, he could see the welcoming committee, a row of palace officials in flowing garments that seemed to shift colors based on their wearers' moods, currently displaying what he hoped was dignified anticipation rather than irritated boredom. At the center stood a tall figure whose robes shimmered with enough embedded circuitry to power a small city. Chancellor Mevris, the pilot said, following his gaze. Charming fellow. Smiles like he's calculating your net worth and finding it disappointing. You know him. Everyone knows him. Been running the practical side of the empire since the old king died. Word is he's not thrilled about a human getting private access to the princess, but the queen regent insisted. She keyed the hatch release. Try not to conjugate any verbs incorrectly. I'd hate to make the return trip alone. The air outside tasted electric, charged with something that made the hair on Eli's arms stand up. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, just intensely present, as if the atmosphere itself was aware of him in a way that Earth's air had never bothered to be. Chancellor Mevris approached with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of moving like a predator in formal wear. Professor Voss, welcome to Kolithara. His voice was smooth, cultured, and carried about as much genuine warmth as a theorem. I trust your journey was uneventful. If by uneventful you mean I kept my breakfast where it belonged, then yes, very uneventful. A flicker of something, surprise, disapproval, crossed the Chancellor's face before smoothing back into diplomatic neutrality. Quite. The princess awaits in the Eastern study. I should mention that Her Highness has been eager for these lessons to begin. The way he said eager suggested it meant something considerably more complicated than simple enthusiasm. But before Eli could ask, they were moving through corridors that seemed to breathe, walls pulsing with faint bioluminescence. Palace servants bowed as they passed, their movements synchronized in a way that suggested either extensive training or low-level telepathic coordination. Probably both. The study was less a room and more a declaration of intent. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking gardens where the flowers moved without wind, shelves lined with data crystals that hummed with stored information, and in the center, standing with her back to the door, a woman who could have passed for human if you didn't notice the ears. They swept upward from her head in elegant points, longer and more pronounced than any Eli had seen in the anatomical briefings, catching the light like polished bronze. Her hair fell in dark waves past her shoulders, and she wore something between a diplomatic uniform and combat gear, practical but unmistakably royal. When she turned, Eli had exactly one coherent thought. The briefing photos hadn't prepared him for the sheer intensity of her presence. "Professor Voss," Princess Caroline said, and her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in his chest. "I've been told you're the most boring human linguist in the known systems. Apparently, that's exactly what I need." Eli blinked. "I'm not sure whether to be flattered or file a complaint with my former students." "Oh, I meant it as a compliment." She moved closer, and the air around her seemed to shimmer slightly, like heat rising from summer pavement. Exciting linguists lecture about phonetic drift at diplomatic dinners. Boring linguists actually teach you how to communicate without starting wars. I've had quite enough excitement lately. Behind him, Chancellor Mevris cleared his throat. "Your Highness, if you experience any difficulties during the lesson, you need only signal." "I'm aware of the protocols, Chancellor." Her tone could have flash-frozen water. "You may go." The Chancellor departed with the stiff-backed dignity of someone who'd just been dismissed and was pretending it was his idea. When the door sealed behind him, Caroline's shoulders dropped slightly, and she suddenly looked younger, more uncertain. "Right then," Eli said, setting his data pad on the nearest surface. "Shall we start with basic greetings, or would you prefer to jump straight to the subjunctive mood? I'm told I make subjunctive conditionals sound absolutely riveting." "Can you actually do that? Make grammar riveting?" "Absolutely not. But I can make it comprehensible, which in my experience is far more useful." She laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise her as much as him, and for a moment everything felt almost normal. Then her expression shifted, eyes unfocusing slightly, and Eli noticed the lights in the study beginning to flicker in rhythm with her breathing. The data crystals on the shelves vibrated, emitting a high-pitched whine that climbed toward the edge of hearing. "Your Highness," he started, but she held up one hand, trembling with effort. "It's fine, I'm fine. This happens sometimes. Just give me a moment." The shimmer around her intensified, and through the windows Eli could see the garden flowers beginning to thrash as if caught in a hurricane, though the air inside remained perfectly still. Caroline's breathing came faster, harsh and ragged, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees in as many seconds. Every instinct told Eli to back away, give her space, call for help. Instead, he took 3 steps forward, close enough to see the fine tremor running through her whole body, and said in his most deliberately boring, professorial voice, "You know, this would be an excellent time to practice the present continuous tense. As in, I am currently wondering if this is covered by my insurance." Her eyes snapped to his face, startled out of whatever internal battle she'd been fighting, and just like that the pressure in the room eased. The lights steadied. The crystals fell silent. In the garden, the flowers settled back into their gentle, windless swaying. Caroline stared at him with an expression somewhere between confusion and wonder. "How did you?" The study door burst open, and a team of palace physicians rushed in carrying crystalline dampeners and scanning equipment, surrounding the princess in a practice formation that spoke of too much experience with this exact situation. They barely acknowledged Eli's presence as they worked, pressing the dampeners against Caroline's temples while monitoring readouts he couldn't begin to interpret. "You're dismissed, Professor," the lead physician said without looking up. "Her Highness requires rest." Eli gathered his materials and made his way back through the breathing corridors, escorted by a silent guard, who deposited him at quarters that were far too luxurious for someone who'd been in system for less than 3 hours. The rooms overlooked the palace gardens, and he stood at the window for a long time, watching the flowers pulse with internal light, replaying those final moments in the study. He'd seen her distress. He'd moved closer. And her distress had visibly lessened. Correlation wasn't causation, of course. That was first-year scientific method. But it was interesting. Very interesting indeed. His personal communication terminal chimed with an incoming message marked urgent priority, and Eli's stomach sank as he read the contents. The Queen Regent requests your presence in the throne room at first light. There are complications we must discuss regarding the princess's condition. Outside, Kolithara's twin stars sank below the horizon, and the palace began to glow with its own captured starlight. Eli poured himself something that the room's automated system promised was similar to coffee and tasted like regret mixed with burnt licorice. Tomorrow, he suspected, was going to be Professor Voss, thank you for your promptness. She gestured, and a seat materialized from the floor beside him, growing up through the polished stone like a plant on fast forward. Please sit. We have much to discuss and little time for the usual diplomatic pleasantries, so I'll dispense with them entirely. My niece is dying. Eli sat down faster than intended. I'm sorry, what? Not immediately, the regent continued as if she just commented on the weather rather than dropped a conversational bomb. She has months, perhaps a year if we're fortunate, unless we find a way to stabilize what's happening to her. She leaned forward slightly. Tell me, Professor, what do you know about Ketharassen? Absolutely nothing, which I suspect you already knew, or this conversation would be going very differently. A ghost of approval flickered across her features. Honest. Good. Too many of your predecessors tried to bluff their way through gaps in knowledge. It's refreshing to meet someone who admits ignorance. She made another gesture, and the air between them shimmered, resolving into a three-dimensional display of what Eli assumed was ethari physiology. Every 7 generations, perhaps 8, one of our people undergoes Ketharassen, a fundamental restructuring of our telepathic capabilities. Those who survive emerge as the most powerful scions our species has ever produced. Those who don't. The image showed a figure collapsing inward, imploding in slow motion. The resulting psychic discharge can devastate entire continents. That seems like a significant design flaw, Eli said, then immediately regretted it when the regent's expression went cold. Evolution rarely consults our preferences, Professor. The condition manifests during times of species-wide stress, a biological response to existential threat. The survivors become powerful enough to protect our people through whatever crisis triggered the transformation. The alternative is extinction. She dismissed the image with a flick of her fingers. Saraline began showing symptoms 3 months ago: emotional amplification, loss of telepathic control, episodes of temporal displacement where she experiences multiple timelines simultaneously. And you think I can help with this because yesterday was the first time in 3 months that an episode resolved without pharmaceutical intervention or physical restraints. The regent's gaze was uncomfortably penetrating. The moment you moved closer, her distress decreased by 47%. The moment you spoke, it dropped another 31%. By the time the medical team arrived, her readings had returned to baseline. Normally, such episodes last anywhere from 20 minutes to 3 hours. Eli's mind raced through possible explanations, each more improbable than the last. That could be coincidence. Sample size of 1, no control group. Which is why you'll continue the language lessons under strict observation. We'll monitor every interaction, measure every variable. If your presence genuinely mitigates her symptoms, we need to understand why. The regent stood, and Eli quickly followed suit, nearly tripping over the chair that was already sinking back into the floor. Chancellor Mevris believes we should maintain traditional isolation protocols. That Saraline should be sequestered in the deep sanctum until Ketharassen runs its course. Historically, this approach has a survival rate of approximately 30%. Those are terrible odds, which is why I'm overruling him. You'll have access to Saraline for 4 hours daily, monitored sessions only. If we observe consistent stabilization, we'll adjust accordingly. If not, she didn't finish the sentence, but Eli heard the unspoken threat clearly enough. The next session took place not in the study but in what the guards called the resonance garden, an enclosed courtyard where every surface hummed with barely audible frequencies. Caroline was already there, sitting cross-legged on a floating platform that drifted 2 feet above an ornamental pond. She looked exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes suggesting sleep had become more theoretical than practical. "They told you, didn't they?" she said without preamble, "about what's happening to me." They used significantly more technical jargon, but yes, I got the general idea. Eli settled onto a bench that was definitely not floating. Thank whatever gods were listening. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm being turned inside out by a sadistic universe with poor timing and no sense of personal boundaries." She laughed, but it had sharp edges. "The technical term is Ketharassen. I call it the absolute worst surprise birthday present evolution could possibly deliver." "When's your birthday?" 3 months ago. Honestly, I would have preferred a gift certificate. Despite everything, the alien world, the dying princess, the weight of observation equipment tracking their every word, Eli found himself smiling. "I'm told I'm supposed to help stabilize your condition through the riveting power of grammar instruction. No pressure. You know what's really unfair? I actually need to learn common tongue. There's a diplomatic summit in 6 months with 17 species, and only 3 of us speak anything close to a shared language." Her platform drifted closer. "Of course, that assumes I survive the next 6 months, which according to the actuarial tables is statistically unlikely." "Do the Ithari have actuarial tables?" "We have predictive algorithms that make your species' actuarial tables look like counting on fingers. Trust me, the numbers aren't encouraging." Eli pulled out his data pad, calling up the first lesson plan he'd prepared. "Right then, let's make sure you survive long enough to bore those 17 species with proper conditional clause construction. We'll start with basic present tense, because I'm told that's how linguistic bonding works. You master the simple concepts, your brain relaxes, and maybe your telepathy stops trying to murder everyone within a 50-mile radius. You have a real gift for motivational speaking. I prefer to think of it as aggressive realism." They worked through conjugations and sentence structures, Eli deliberately keeping his voice level and calm, watching Caroline's reactions to different phonetic patterns. Halfway through explaining the difference between "I am going" and "I go," he noticed her breathing had steadied, the shimmer around her barely visible. The garden's hum had adjusted itself to match her heartbeat, the frequencies synchronizing in a way that felt almost musical. "You're doing that thing again," Caroline said suddenly. "What thing?" "That aggressively boring professor thing, where you make verb tenses sound like the most important thing in the universe. It's working. I can feel the noise in my head quieting down." She tilted her head, studying him with unsettling intensity. "Why doesn't it work with anyone else? Maybe I'm just that boring. But everyone else who tries to calm me down treats me like I'm made of glass about to shatter. They're terrified. You're—" She searched for the word, clinically unimpressed. "Like my potential to cause planetary devastation is mildly interesting but not particularly concerning." "Would it help if I pretended to be more concerned?" "Absolutely not. Please continue being weirdly unbothered by my existential crisis." They continued until Caroline's attention began to fracture, her eyes losing focus, as if she was seeing through multiple layers of reality simultaneously. Eli immediately shifted topics, launching into an explanation of irregular verb forms with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for discussing paint drying. He named the most ridiculous examples he could think of: drive, drove, driven, eat, making up fake etymologies that were probably offensive to actual linguistic scholarship. "You're making that up," Caroline accused, but she was smiling, present again. "Absolutely I am. But you're listening, which means you're not fragmenting across dimensional boundaries, so I'm calling it a pedagogical victory." Later, as guards escorted him back to his quarters, Eli reviewed the session recordings on his data pad. The monitoring equipment had tracked everything: brainwave patterns, telepathic field fluctuations, even quantum probability matrices that he didn't have the physics background to properly interpret. But one pattern was undeniable. When he spoke, when he maintained that deliberately calm presence, Saraline's reading stabilized. He was about to shut down the pad when he noticed a footnote in the medical file, marked with the highest security clearance. His credentials shouldn't have allowed access, but someone, probably the regent, had overridden the restrictions. The text was brief, clinical, and absolutely terrifying. Ketharassen subjects who fail to stabilize within the first 4 months experience complete psychic fragmentation. Consciousness disperses across parallel timelines. Subject becomes unstuck in probability. No recorded survivors. Saraline had been symptomatic for 3 months. They had 1 month to figure out why his presence helped, or she would literally cease to exist in any single timeline. No pressure indeed. His terminal chimed with an incoming message from Saraline herself, sent through official palace channels. Professor Monotone, thanks for today. Same time tomorrow, try to be even more boring. My sanity depends on it, S. Eli typed back. Will prepare my most tedious lecture on semicolon usage. Your sanity won't know what hit it. Outside his window, the garden flowers pulsed in complex patterns, and somewhere in the palace, he knew Saraline was probably still awake, fighting to remain singular in a universe that wanted to tear her across infinite possibilities. Tomorrow they'd try again. Tomorrow he'd be boring enough to keep her alive. He'd faced worse odds, probably, maybe not. The coffee that wasn't coffee tasted slightly less like regret tonight. That felt like progress. 3 weeks into their daily sessions, Eli made the mistake of actually enjoying himself. This should have been his first warning that something was about to go catastrophically wrong. Saraline had mastered the present perfect tense with what he could only describe as vindictive enthusiasm, wielding, have been, and has gone, with the precision of someone who decided that if she was going to learn irregular verb forms, she was going to learn them better than anyone in galactic history. Today they were tackling the conditional mood, sitting in the resonance garden while she constructed increasingly elaborate hypothetical scenarios. If I were a human linguist, she said, eyes glinting with amusement, I would have fled this assignment the moment someone mentioned psychic storms. If I were smart, Eli countered, I would have asked more questions before accepting a position described as routine diplomatic instruction. What would you have done differently if you'd known? Absolutely nothing. The pay is terrible, but the company is surprisingly tolerable. She laughed, and the garden responded, flowers blooming in rapid succession like applause made botanical. Her episodes had decreased in frequency and intensity over the past weeks, occurring only once or twice daily instead of every few hours. The medical team cautiously suggested progress. The Queen Regent remained skeptically optimistic. Chancellor Mevris watched everything with the expression of someone witnessing a structural integrity failure in slow motion. He hates this, Saraline said, following Eli's gaze toward where the Chancellor observed from a balcony over traditional protocols with a 30% survival rate. Tradition cares more about purity than probability. She picked up a data crystal from the collection beside her, turning it over in her fingers. There's going to be a formal court session tonight. Mevris has requested an emergency council to discuss my treatment. I thought you should know. Should I be concerned? Depends. How do you feel about being publicly accused of contaminating an evolutionary process with your dangerously foreign presence? Is there a formal rebuttal process, or do I just stand there looking boringly human? I'd recommend the latter. It's worked remarkably well so far. The council chamber made the throne room look modest, which Eli hadn't thought was geometrically possible. Representatives from every major Ithari house lined the curved walls, their formal robes creating a rainbow of political affiliation. Chancellor Mevris stood at the central podium, and even from across the chamber Eli could see the satisfied set to his jaw. "We gather to address a matter of profound importance," Mevris began, his voice amplified through the chamber's acoustic design. "The treatment of our crown princess during her sacred transformation. For generations, Ketharassen has been managed through isolation, meditation, and traditional dampening protocols. These methods, tested through time, respect the purity of our evolutionary process." He paused for effect. "Yet we now employ an alien, a human, whose very presence alters the princess's neural patterns in ways we cannot fully predict or control." Murmurs rippled through the assembled representatives. Eli, standing in the defendant's circle with Caroline beside him, and the Queen Regent on her throne above, tried to look professionally unconcerned, rather than deeply uncomfortable. "Professor Voss's methods show measurable results," the Regent interjected smoothly. "The princess's episodes have decreased by 63%. "At what cost?" Mevris turned to face them directly. "We measure frequency and intensity, yes, but do we measure contamination? The human's neural patterns are fundamentally different from ours. His presence creates a dampening effect, certainly, but perhaps it merely masks the symptoms while the underlying condition worsens. We may be trading short-term stability for long-term catastrophe." "That's a fascinating theory," Eli heard himself say, and immediately regretted it when every eye in the chamber turned toward him. "I apologize, I didn't mean to speak out of turn." "Please," the Regent said with the tone of someone who absolutely meant the opposite, "continue. I just wondered if there's any evidence supporting the contamination hypothesis, or if we're engaging in speculative xenophobia dressed up in medical terminology." The chamber went very quiet. Caroline made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh or a choked gasp, possibly both. Mevris's expression could have flash-frozen hydrogen. "You dare accuse this council of prejudice?" "I'm suggesting that different therefore dangerous isn't a scientific argument, it's a logical fallacy. The princess's condition has measurably improved. If you have data suggesting my presence causes harm beyond making verb conjugation slightly less painful, I'm genuinely interested to see it." "The harm may not be immediate," another council member interjected, an elderly woman whose robes suggested she represented one of the traditionalist houses. "Ketharassen survivors emerge as our most powerful scions because they endure the full transformation unassisted. If we artificially suppress symptoms, we may produce a diminished result." "With respect," Eli said, trying to channel every diplomatic training module he'd ever ignored, "a diminished living princess seems preferable to a fully transformed dead one." "You oversimplify." "He really doesn't," Caroline cut in, her voice carrying harmonics that made the chamber's crystals vibrate. "The actuarial models give me 4 more weeks at current progression rates. 4 weeks before I fragment permanently. Every day Professor Voss helps me maintain stability is another day I don't cease to exist across infinite timelines. I'm remarkably attached to existing, personally." "Your Highness," Mevris said with exaggerated patience, "your attachment to this human may itself be symptomatic. Ketharassen amplifies all emotions, including inappropriate dependencies." "Oh, I see. So if I find his teaching helpful, it's a symptom. If I opposed his presence, it would be clear thinking. How convenient that your logic only works in one direction." The Queen Regent stood, and the chamber fell silent immediately. "Enough. The Council's concerns are noted. Professor Voss will continue his work under enhanced monitoring. If we observe any indication of genuine harm, we'll revisit protocols. Until then, we prioritize my niece's survival over theoretical purity." She turned to Mevris with a smile that could cut glass. "Unless you'd like to explain to the Empire why we let our heir die to preserve tradition." The council adjourned with the kind of tense silence that suggested nothing had been resolved, merely postponed. As representatives filed out, Eli caught several watching him with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Saraline touched his arm briefly, a gesture that probably violated 17 different protocols. "That was either very brave or very stupid," she said quietly. "I'm a linguist. We specialize in not knowing when to shut up." "Thank you for defending me, for not backing down." Someone had to point out that surviving seems like a reasonable priority. They walked through corridors that had become familiar over the past weeks, heading towards Saraline's private quarters, where their evening session would continue away from council politics. The route took them through the palace's eastern wing, past windows overlooking the city below where bioluminescent towers pulsed with contained energy. "Can I ask you something?" Saraline said suddenly. "And I want an honest answer, not a diplomatic one. I've demonstrated a remarkable inability to provide diplomatic answers, so that should be easy. Why are you really here? I've read your file. You were one of the top linguists in human space, teaching at the most prestigious university on Earth. You could have stayed there comfortably. Instead, you accepted a position teaching basic grammar to an alien princess on a remote moon. Why?" Eli considered several responses before settling on truth. "Because every other assignment was boring, comfortable, prestigious, completely predictable. I was teaching the same material to different students year after year, slowly calcifying into an academic fossil. Then your aunt's people offered me something genuinely challenging, genuinely unknown. So I said yes. You took this job because you were bored. I took this job because I wasn't living, I was just existing. Turns out there's a difference." She stopped walking, turned to face him fully. The corridor's lighting made her features sharp and strange, highlighted the elegant sweep of her ears, the intensity in her eyes. "You know what I realized today? During Mevris's little performance, that politics is universally terrible regardless of species. That you don't flinch. Everyone else, even Aunt Lysara, even the people who genuinely care about me, they all flinch when I'm near. They feel the pressure of what I'm becoming, the potential danger, and they can't help but react. But you," she stepped closer, "you don't feel it, do you? The psychic weight. The way I distort probability fields just by existing nearby. I don't have telepathy, maybe I'm just oblivious. Or maybe that's exactly why it works. Everyone else is trying to shield themselves from me while simultaneously trying to help me. You're just present, undefended, unconcerned." Her voice dropped quieter. "It's not just that you calm the storms, Eli. When you're near, I feel singular, real, like I exist in only one place one time, without you." Alarms shrieked through the corridor, red emergency lighting flooding the space. Saraline gasped, staggered, and Eli caught her arm as she swayed. Around them, the walls rippled like water, solid stone becoming momentarily translucent, revealing ghostly overlays of different corridors, different timelines, different versions of the palace occupying the same space. "Guards!" Eli shouted, supporting Saraline's weight as her eyes unfocused, pupils dilating and contracting in rapid succession. "We need medical assistance." But the guards weren't coming. Through the translucent walls, he could see them frozen mid-step, caught in some kind of temporal distortion field. Time itself was breaking down around Saraline, and they were at the center of it. "Eli," she whispered, and he heard the fear under her voice. "I can see them, all of them, every version of myself. There's one where I died at birth, one where I never developed Ketharassen, one where I became a tyrant. One where," she screamed, a sound of pure agony, and the corridor shattered into fractal possibilities. He did the only thing he could think of. He wrapped his arms around her and started reciting irregular verbs, loud and clear and aggressively boring, while reality fell apart around them and somewhere in the palace. Chancellor Mevris surely smiled. The corridor existed in 7 states simultaneously, and Eli had the distinct impression that reality was filing a formal complaint about the violation. Through the fractal chaos, he could see versions of Saraline, young, old, triumphant, broken, crowned, dead, all occupying the same space, phasing in and out like a holographic projection with catastrophic technical difficulties. "Bring brought," he said firmly, his voice somehow cutting through the dimensional static. "Think thought, feel felt. That's not helping," one version of Caroline gasped, or maybe all of them said it, a chorus of temporal variants speaking in imperfect unison. "Shut up and let me finish. Catch caught, teach taught." The repetition created a rhythm, something predictable in the chaos. He felt her heartbeat against his chest, racing but beginning to synchronize with his words. The overlapping versions flickered, some fading while others became more solid. "This is the worst possible time for grammar lessons," she managed, and Eli noted with relief that it was a single voice now, still strained but singular. "Would you prefer I panic instead? Because I can do that. I'm very good at panicking. It's one of my core competencies." Despite everything, the fractured reality, the alarms, the sensation of existing in multiple timelines at once, she laughed. The sound acted like a tuning fork, and suddenly the corridor snapped back into a single coherent version of itself. The overlapping Sarah lines collapsed into one, solid and present and trembling in his arms. Guards finally burst through the doors, medical team close behind, but Eli noticed something crucial. The equipment they carried was different from the usual dampeners. These looked more like restraints. "Stand away from the princess," the lead guard commanded, and there was something off about his tone, too formal, too rehearsed. "What's happening?" Caroline, none of which would have resolved if Eli hadn't been there, Caroline argued, but more guards were arriving, surrounding them in a practiced formation. "Your attachment to the human is noted, Highness. It's also considered symptomatic. Please don't make this more difficult." They separated them efficiently, professionally, and Eli found himself being escorted not to his comfortable quarters, but to a holding cell deep in the palace's lower levels, where the walls didn't breathe and the air tasted recycled. The guard who sealed him inside looked apologetic, but not apologetic enough to actually disobey orders. "For what it's worth," the guard said, "most of us think you were helping." But the Chancellor made a convincing case to the Queen Regent. Something about uncontrolled bonding effects, dangerous emotional dependencies, risk of complete psychic collapse if your influence is removed too late. "And if removing my influence causes the collapse?" "Above my clearance level, Professor, I'm sorry." The cell contained a bench, a waste disposal unit, and absolutely nothing else. Eli sat down and tried to think through the panic. Mevris had orchestrated this perfectly. Wait for a major episode, blame it on foreign contamination, use emergency powers to override the regent's authority. Classic political maneuvering with the minor addition of potentially killing the crown princess through aggressive traditionalism. Hours passed. The cell's lighting never changed, making time feel elastic and unreliable. Eli dozed fitfully, dreaming of fractured timelines and Caroline's voice calling to him from too many directions at once. He woke to alarms, different from before, deeper and more urgent. The cell's walls vibrated with harmonic frequencies that made his teeth ache, and through the sealed door he could hear distant screams, the sound of crystal shattering, thunder without weather. The door opened. Not because someone unlocked it. The locking mechanism simply ceased to exist, matter rearranging itself at the molecular level. The Queen Regent stood outside, her composure cracked for the first time since Eli had met her. "She's fragmenting," Lysara said without preamble. "Complete psychic collapse. We have minutes, maybe less. The dampeners aren't working, the isolation protocols are accelerating the breakdown, and she's taking the palace with her." She grabbed his arm. "I was wrong. Mevris was wrong. Whatever you were doing, it wasn't suppressing the transformation, it was anchoring her through it. We need you in the throne room now." They ran through corridors where reality was wearing thin, past guards frozen in temporal loops, through doorways that led to 3 different destinations simultaneously. The palace groaned around them, bioarchitecture dying as Saraline's consciousness fragmented across probability matrices. The throne room was worse. Much worse. Saraline floated above the floor, her body phasing in and out of solidity as multiple versions of herself overlapped. The air around her rippled with psychic energy, and Eli could see through her to countless alternate timelines, one where the palace was ruins, another where it had never been built, another where Kolithara itself was a lifeless rock. She was becoming unstuck from singular existence, dispersing across infinite possibilities. Saraline. He moved forward without thinking, ignoring the regent's warning shout, and the psychic maelstrom hit him like a physical wall. Pain lanced through his skull as fractured realities tore at his consciousness, showing him versions of himself he'd never become, the one who stayed on Earth, the one who died in transit, the one who arrived too late. Eli. Her voice came from everywhere and nowhere. I can't hold on. There are too many timelines, too many choices, too many versions of who I could have been. Then pick one, he said, forcing the words through the chaos. Pick this one. Why this timeline specifically? Because I'm in it. Because we had 3 weeks of aggressively boring grammar lessons. Because you called me Professor Monotone and made jokes about semicolons. Because in this timeline right now, I'm telling you something I should have said weeks ago. He took another step forward, reality fracturing around him. I love you. This version of you, this moment, this singular point in space and time. I choose this timeline, and I'm asking you to choose it with me. The confession hung in the air, and for a moment nothing happened. Then, slowly, the overlapping versions of Saraline began to fade. Not disappearing, but converging, probability waves collapsing into a single outcome. She solidified, became real and present and singular, and fell. Eli caught her, both of them collapsing to the floor in a tangle of limbs and exhaustion. She was solid, warm, breathing hard but breathing steadily. Around them, the throne room stopped disintegrating. The psychic storm dissipated. Reality remembered how to be singular again. That was extremely manipulative, Saraline said into his shoulder. Confessing your feelings during my moment of existential crisis. Did it work? Obviously it worked. I'm corporeal again, aren't I? The Queen Regent approached cautiously, flanked by medical personnel who began scanning Saraline with equipment that beeped in patterns suggesting cautious optimism. The transformation stabilized, one of them reported, incredulous. Her telepathic matrices have integrated without fragmenting. This has never been documented. Where's Mevris? Saraline asked, sitting up with Eli's help. Placed under house arrest pending investigation into his manipulation of emergency protocols, Lysara said crisply. His political career is over, though I suspect he'll claim he was acting in the Empire's best interest until the end. He probably believes it too, Eli said. Tradition over evidence, it's a common problem. 3 months later, Eli stood in the resonance garden watching Saraline demonstrate her new abilities for a delegation of visiting dignitaries. She could now consciously manipulate probability fields, encouraging favorable outcomes without forcing them, turning might happen into likely to happen through sheer focused will. The visitors were appropriately impressed, which was the point of the demonstration. Your Highness, one of them said with the carefully neutral tone of someone asking an uncomfortable question, the human who anchored your transformation, is he to be permanently stationed here? Professor Voss has accepted a position as my permanent linguistic advisor and quantum anchor, Saraline replied formally, then caught Eli's eye and smiled. Also, he makes terrible jokes about verb tenses, which I've discovered is essential for maintaining psychic stability. That's a very specific job requirement, Eli said after the delegation departed. I'm a very specific person. She moved closer, took his hand. Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't get bored again and wander off to find another exciting assignment. I don't think anything could be more exciting than helping a princess, Avoid fragmenting across infinite timelines. Don't tempt the universe. It has a terrible sense of humor. They walked through gardens where flowers bloomed in patterns matching Caroline's heartbeat, past fountains that flowed upward because probability suggested they might, through a palace that had learned to breathe in sync with its future queen. Somewhere in the diplomatic quarter, preparations continued for the 17th Species Summit, where Caroline would deliver speeches in flawless common tongue, with only occasional telepathic enhancement. Chancellor Mevris, in his comfortable exile, was reportedly writing a treatise on traditional values and the dangers of foreign influence. Nobody was expected to read it. "Can I ask you something?" Caroline said as they reached the eastern terrace where Kolithara's twin stars painted the sky in complementary colors. "You're going to ask if I really meant what I said during your existential crisis, or if it was just pragmatic quantum observation to collapse your probability wave." "How did you?" "Because I've been waiting 3 months for you to ask, and you're terrible at hiding when something's bothering you. Your ears twitch." She reached up self-consciously. "They do not." "They absolutely do, and yes, I meant it. I would have told you anyway, eventually. The impending multiversal fragmentation just accelerated my timeline. That might be the least romantic confession I've ever heard. Would you have preferred poetry? I could compose something about irregular verbs and quantum entanglement." "Please don't." He kissed her instead, there on the terrace with the binary stars setting and the palace humming contentedly around them.